All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. This is Sociology of Youth and Religion. All right, so I'm going to take a little sideways trip here, between Catholic schools and summer camps, just to talk about this question of science and religion. Because I think some interesting stuff sort of came out of the National Study of Youth and Religion. Again, we're mostly dealing here with millennials, that speaks to the maybe fraught relationship that science and religion have amongst young people today. All right, so I'll just play this video. It has no sound in it. So this is from Pew. Are science and religion in conflict with each other? Most Americans say yes, right? 59% say it's often in conflict. 38% say it's mostly compatible, right? So a majority says they're often in conflict. Fewer say science conflicts with their own views. Does not conflict is almost 70% versus 30% say it conflicts. The least religiously observant are the most likely to say that science and religion conflict. Right. So when we see, seldom or nevers, it's 73% versus 25%. So 73% think it's in conflict. Monthly or yearly attenders, it's just over half. And then, at least weekly, there's basically a more or less 50-50 split. All right, so that's it. Just a little video there, right? And just to show this potential conflict between science and religion at the end of the day. Okay, so the results here mostly drawn again from the National Study of Youth and Religion, and I took a lot of this information essentially out of this talk and a piece that was published for the McGrath Institute at University of Notre Dame. This is an institute dedicated to kind of church life, the way the church moves in the world. So it was called Pastoral Issues in Science and Human Dignity at the University of Notre Dame in 2014. The link there obviously will take you to the full talk, and it has some really interesting stuff in it. Okay, so according to Christian Smith, so in 2014 when he is doing this presentation, most college-aged emerging adults basically accepted what you might call the inherent warfare model of the relationship between science and religion, right? Basically the idea that there's an inevitable conflict between the two, right? And that religion will always be the loser. And I think this quote on the side, right, this myth doesn't talk about it, it encapsulates this view quite nicely, right? This from Robert Ingersoll. There's no harmony between religion and science. When science was a child, religion sought to strangle it in its cradle. Now that science has attained its youth and superstition is in its dotage, the trembling, palsied wreck says to the athlete, let us be friends. Okay, so this view that, there's an inevitable kind of conflict between science and religion really comes to us from a period called the Enlightenment, right? So the Enlightenment is this period, right, mostly in the 18th century. There's a couple of different enlightenments we can talk about. The French Enlightenment, where I think this model mostly comes from, and then the Scottish Enlightenment, which is a little bit different and a lot more economic in its natures. But basically, right, the form that the argument takes is that when we had the Roman Empire and ancient Greece, the world was developing scientifically and along the lines of reason. And then as Edward Gibbon, right, who is the historian who famously wrote the multi-volume history, the decline and fall of the Roman Empire back in the 19th century, basically, what Gibbon says is, that the gray breath of the Nazarene is extinguished the light of Rome, right? So that the gray breath of the Nazarene is obviously like the teachings of Jesus basically came and wiped away, all that was great about the ancient world. Now, what I'll say is that this account has been widely believed for a long time, right? And from this idea that, Rome and Greece were periods of enlightenment, and when Christianity came along, all that enlightenment kind of disappeared. We get the idea of what's sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages, right? this 1,000-year period, basically between about 500, so the Roman Empire collapsed around 471, so about 500 to about 1500, and the scientific revolution, right? But basically, Christianity comes along and it's superstitious and it hates science and it hates reason, and it casts Europe into 1,000 years of the Dark Ages. And religion, but especially here Christianity, suppressed science, right? And whenever science tried to pop its head up, and the key evidence that's often given here is the Galileo affair, right? So whenever science kind of tried to pop its head up, religion came and smacked it down like you were playing whack-a-mole. But yeah, only once then did people reject religion and turn back to scientific reason in the Enlightenment was scientific progress made. Okay, so there's a lot of things to unpack here in this kind of cultural account. For one thing, it's part of, I think, a brilliant marketing kind of scheme on the part of the Enlightenment thinkers that this account was so successful. I mean, really responsible historians, I think, no longer really believe in this, the Enlightenment narrative of progress as it's sometimes referred to, or even that, medieval Europe was a period of darkness. And I mean, here, you can go back to my good buddy Rodney Stark, who I think does a nice job of this in a book called How the West Won, about basically why the West ultimately sort of outcompeted other parts of the world. And I mean, there's a lot to that book, but one of his kind of theses is that actually from a scientific and kind of reason point of view, both ancient Greece and Rome especially were times of relative scientific and technological stagnation, right? That while the Romans were extraordinary engineers, as scientists, they left something to be desired, and they sort of got caught in a sense, worshiping Aristotelian sort of logic and reason, and kind of got trapped within it. It was only, once we entered the Middle Ages, and, especially periods like, getting into, say, like the 14th century with someone like Thomas Aquinas, were we able to kind of move forward. And what Stark will say is that, the society that went into the Middle Ages, or, what has been, again, pejoratively called the Dark Ages, ultimately emerged from the Middle Ages the most technologically advanced in the world, right? Having far surpassed societies that started ahead of it. So there's a lot of innovation that happened in the Middle Ages. The growth of the scientific method was essentially, in a lot of ways, nurtured actually in the universities that were founded by the Catholic Church. So the story is much more, I think, complex, nuanced, and interesting. I think both Stark does it well in How the West Won, and David Bentley Hart does a good job of it in the very poorly titled, by his own admission, Atheist Delusions, the Christian Revolution and its fashionable enemies. And why I say it's poorly named is because he hated the title, but the publisher made him put it on. He does a really interesting job also of tracing out the sort of origins of science through Western Europe. But this account that comes to us from the Enlightenment, that religion ultimately is at war with science and with reason, is one that remains with us at the end of the day, right? So successful was it in its pitch during the Enlightenment that we remain kind of tied to it in a lot of really important ways. And we still have this notion that science and religion are kind of at odds with each other, right? That science and religion can't coexist necessarily, because science is always right and religion is always wrong. Now this has also been kind of crystallized by a lot of particularly salient cultural moments. And the one that whether you're aware of it or not, definitely had this kind of moment of salience was something called the Scopes Monkey Trial. And the Scopes Monkey Trial was basically done in Tennessee. I think it was in Scopes. And basically a public school teacher wanted to teach the theory of evolution in school, and basically was banned from doing so by the school board, right? Because they were strict creationists. and he was taken to court, right, in what was famously called the Scopes monkey trial. And famously, the prosecutor won. Um, William James Bryant. Um, and there's still a college named Bryant College in the place where the Scopes monkey trial took place. Sorry, I remember now. It took place in Dayton, Tennessee. So very famously, the prosecutor in the case, so the person put on trial was John Thomas Scopes. So the person put on trial in this particular case, and again, yeah, William Jennings Bryant um, was the prosecutor. Bryant won, right? He won the case, but the public opinion at the time, and especially as it was reported, got picked up nationally and internationally, that this person was being put on trial for teaching the theory of evolution in public school. And, places like the New York Times published mocking accounts of it. So even though William Jennings Bryant, the prosecutor, won the case, it was marked as a loss for fundamentalist Christianity because it exposed itself as an anti-intellectual and anti-scientific kind of movement. And so this, events like this have been used as evidence that yes, religious people are dumb, religion is dumb, and ultimately that religion and science are incompatible. Okay, so looking at this, I love this picture, by the way. This hard line between science and religion on this little graphic, right? And the guy who's about to step across the line is being shooed away. Okay, so when we look at American emerging adults, right? About 7 out of 10 in the category of 18 to 23 agree or strongly agree that the teachings of science and religion are often in conflict with each other. Now, this is especially low for Latter-day Saints or Mormons at only about 46%, and especially high, our kind of the median is sort of the Jews at about 65%. About 2/3. This question is kind of funnily asked, and this is where someone like Smith kind of shows the art of asking these opposite kind of phrased survey questions. But about 2/3 of religious emerging adults disagreed or strongly disagreed that the findings of science and the teachings of religion are entirely compatible, right? So you see that the first one is, are they in conflict, and then the other one is, are they entirely compatible? So about 66% of religious emerging adults didn't think that they are entirely compatible. Now, so 2/3 of religious emerging adults, 3/4 of non-religious youth disagreed with the same statement, right? So majorities, vast majorities in both cases, but you see where the non-religious really think science and religion are in major conflict. And about 60% of religious youth disagreed with the statement, my views about religion/religious faith have been strengthened by some discoveries of science. And again, LDS came in very high here at 60% agreement with the statement. So, what quality it is of being a Latter-day Saint that makes that particularly believable, I don't know, but it seems to be working for them. Okay, so this data came from a document that I've posted on eClass in the folder, written by Smith and Mangloss Weber. And again, this data is principally from the National Study of Youth and Religion. Okay, so what is it? And it happened particularly to do with Catholics. And this document happens to be looking at people who have left the Catholic Church and kind of why. Okay, so emerging adults basically struggle to reconcile some of the teachings of Catholicism with the principles of scientific proof and logic they usually take as the ultimate authority on truth and reality. Okay, so this is an interesting one, right? Because I think this speaks really to the erosion in kind of a Peter Berger type of way of plausibility structures, right? The most plausible account of reality for most people seems to be the scientific one, right? That worldview ultimately makes the most sense. So even this notion, right, that the teachings of Catholicism have to be reconciled with the principles of scientific proof and logic suggests very much where the plausibility structures of our society lie, right? They don't lie in religion. They ultimately lie principally in science. Okay. The second point, right, that even some emerging adults who identify as Catholic did so almost sheepishly, apologizing for their failure to live completely by the rules of science as they understand them, right? So being religious, for these young people that were interviewed as part of the National Study of Youth and Religion, um, boy, are you probably sick of hearing me say National Study of Youth and Religion. Um, Basically, they felt like they had to somehow justify or apologize for the fact that, their religious faith meant that they weren't fully living by the rules of science as they understood them. Um, you know, even those former Catholic adults, so young people who had left the Catholic Church but continued to believe in God, right? These are nuns or something similar to this. Would say things like about faith, like, I know it's not scientific, but again, suggesting that where society puts its truth claims, or its faith in truth claims, is entirely within a sort of materialist, empiricist sort of method, right? Why? And I mean, there is obviously something to be said for this, right? Science has been tremendously successful in improving human life, right? The life of human beings is tremendously improved by the fact that, we've made such tremendous scientific advances. Um, Along with that has come this sort of cultural acceptance that the truth claims of science are the only kinds of truth claims that really matter. Now, I mean, I think it's probably worth noting that, better philosophers than I, certainly, the likes of David Bentley Hart, especially, who I quite admire as a philosopher, have suggested that there are, most of the things we don't know according to the scientific method, right? Like, how do you know your mother loves you? Did you perform an experiment, right? We know a great many things, and we rely on that knowledge. And obviously, that there's other forms of truth other than, simply things that can be empirically deduced. So is Shakespeare true? Well, it certainly makes true statements about, say, the human condition, which is why it's endured for so long, or the works of Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Charles Dickens, right? All of these things in some sense are true, though not true in the scientific sense. So, the plausibility structures have sort of been geared towards, I think, a very bare empiricist sort of way of knowing the world and what truth claims are. And again, I think this is fundamentally a sort of success of the Enlightenment, right? And the Enlightenment's narrative that there's reason, and we have to sort of give over our whole selves to reason, and human society should be entirely governed by reason, right? And that, this is certainly as a sociologist, right? Like, sociology is supposed to be the discipline which applies the scientific method to society, because it assumes that that's the best way to know about society. Now, again, this is a perfectly questionable claim, and there certainly are other things that could claim to making truth claims that can provide different sorts of evidence and different kinds of understandings. But the triumph of the scientific as our basic way of knowing the world, and our basic way of sort of doing the quick heuristic, like, is this statement true? Well, what does science say about it? And I mean, we heard this, in between the years 2020 and 2023, so much, right? The science says, or the science is settled, right? As a sort of end statement, saying we don't need to talk about this anymore because it's been established as a truth, right? Again, I don't want to beat on this too hard. I've probably, spent 5 minutes on this slide. I've probably talked too much already. But I do think there really is something to be said about the fact that science has so conquered our cultural understanding that now to somehow not be sufficiently scientific is seen as ultimately sort of a mark of failure. Okay, so again from Smith and Mangloss Weber. Yeah, so when former Catholic emerging adults sort of say why they think science and religion might be incompatible, they often sort of connect it with this kind of vague notion that belief should be kept open-ended, right? That somehow to make up your mind and to commit yourself to a particular religious understanding, one that maybe, a set philosophical system, um, is not a good thing, right? And so we see this, right? I think we've definitely seen this when we talked about millennials and when we talked about Gen Z earlier in the course, right? That open-mindedness is something that's highly valued by younger generations, right? Here we're talking about millennials. Right, they often attribute bravery or strength to not knowing the ultimate answers about existence, right? And think about faith unbundled, right? Think about faith unbundled again. I know I'm always bringing in concepts from earlier in the course. One of these values that Packer talks bundled is what? Right? This idea of this kind of search for knowledge, right? The young people don't want to be told the answers, right? They don't want to be given the answers. They want to discover them for themselves, right? There's a sort of bravery or a strength or a valor. It is virtuous, right? One of the virtues of millennials and Gen Z is the search for truth. But here, in a sense, the bravery or strength to not know the ultimate answers about existence, right? A valor in kind of indeterminacy, which is very interesting, right? This seems to be like to say that you've sort of locked in, and that I don't know, I believe in whatever, Buddha or Jesus or Muhammad, right, is seen as a sort of failure to be sufficiently open-minded, right? And yeah, a strong belief in God or a particular faith is seen as unhealthy. Unhealthy. So this is, again, such an interesting sort of kind of way of thinking, because it's so different from say the boomers or the silent generation, where you would have been very defined by your particular faith, right? But in this sense, too strong of a belief in God or attachment to a faith is unhealthy, right? Because it contradicts the value they attach to being flexible and pragmatic about belief in a complicated and diverse world, right? The world is so complex. Well, how can we ever know anything? And again, I'm not saying any of these things are bad, right? I just think this is very interesting, right? That this sort of indeterminacy, and the kind of sense that everything should be iterative and constantly changing, right? And I think we see this, in the sort of deconstruction accounts of faith, right? That people will go through kind of and deconstruct their faith. And this is something that's become very popular, especially in evangelical circles, to deconstruct your faith, right? Because like to too closely lock in on what you believe is unvirtuous, right? Because you're not being flexible and pragmatic. You're not, accepting the nuance of the world or other points of view, or all of these sorts of things. So again, it is really kind of interesting. Like they want to be open-minded and open-ended, but at the same time, science sort of ends up being the final authority, which again is a contradiction. But then, science is also iterative, right? And science can change. So it's almost like, well, religion should be like that, or my personal faith should be like that, always changing based on kind of new evidence. And maybe that's the right way. I don't know. But that does seem to be what millennials and Gen Z believe. Okay, so according to these kinds of results, nearly all American youth associate science with evidence and proof, right? And again, this is sort of what I'm saying. It's plausible because it has evidence and proof. Whereas religion is implausible, increasingly, because it's associated with blind faith, it's private, it's subjective, and it's just someone's opinion. So what does that mean, right? It can't be proved, right? You can't prove the existence of God, right? Not in the same way, right? So despite the fact that, like, if we look at, say, someone like Thomas Aquinas, posited that there were 5 proofs of the existence of God. Now, when Thomas Aquinas called them proofs, right? What Aquinas is referring to is not so much, scientific proof. Like you can measure God and put him in a test tube, right? They're philosophical proofs, right? So, I just pulled them up on my phone. The argument, one of the proofs is the argument for motion, right? Our senses could perceive motion by seeing the things act on one another. Whatever moves is moved by something else. Consequently, there has to be a first mover, right? This is an argument that Aquinas gets from Aristotle. That creates this great chain of motion. This is God. God sets all things in motion and gives them their potential, right? The argument from efficient cause, right? Because nothing can cause itself, everything must have a cause or something that creates an effect on another thing. Without a first cause, there would be no others. Therefore, the first cause is God. The argument from necessary being, because objects in the world come into existence and pass out of it, it is possible for those objects to exist or not exist at any particular time. However, nothing can come from nothing. This means something must exist at all times. This is God. The argument from gradation, there are different degrees of goodness in different things. Following the great chain of being, which states that there is a gradual increase in complexity, created objects move from unformed inorganic matter to biologically complex organisms. Therefore, there must be a being of the highest form of good. This perfect being is God. And the argument from design, all things have an order or arrangement. This leads them to a particular goal. Because the order of the universe cannot be the result of chance, design, and purpose must be at work, it implies the divine intelligence on the part of the designer. This is God. Okay, so all right, these are Aquinas' 5 proofs of the existence of God. But I think you should hopefully be able to see these are philosophical proofs. They are not, in fact, proof in the sense of like I found a God particle in a test tube, and that led me to the belief that God exists, right? Or I can prove that God exists because I found God particles. Now, of course, and here we are talking about Roman Catholic youth, right? Or formerly Roman Catholic youth. And so, in the sense, right, they haven't obviously been sort of educated in obviously this thing that comes out of the Catholic tradition, right? Because Thomas Aquinas is a doctor of the church, right? But again, it sort of kind of limits proof to scientific proof and excludes any other kind of way of knowing the universe. Again, right or wrong, right? The power of the scientific method has so sort of taken over society that is in a sense the only kind of proof that people are primed to believe in. It's the only one that fits that plausibility structure. And something like, Aquinas' 5 proofs, which are, I read you kind of a sketch of them. They're deeply philosophically complex. They have deep levels of argumentation behind them. Their logic, I think, is inherently, in a lot of ways, it's Thomistic, obviously, but also Aristotelian, right? But it doesn't have the same weight, even if they're good philosophical arguments, which, some people think they are, some people think they aren't. They don't have that same kind of power of proof, right? Because all that, in a sense, can be proved is what's empirical, right? And so your subjective experiences don't count in the same way, which is, a little funny for a generation that also puts a high mark on my lived experience. But, lived experiences of faith apparently don't count as proof because they're private, subjective, and they're, in the sense, blind, according to this kind of narrative. And again, I don't know that it's fair to say all faith is blind. Some certainly is. Others, have reasons to believe what they believe, whether intellectual or personal, right? Their interaction with the divine through prayer or some other form, right? Definitely for them constitutes proof. Anyway, so I'm rambling on because I think this is interesting, and it's one of those things where I do think that our kind of empiricist notion, our materialist notion of proof is ultimately kind of an impoverished one, but it is the one that seems to be shared by most young people. It isn't rational, right? It isn't something that, because it's blind, right? It's blind faith, and blind faith isn't rational. it's passed down to you or something, right? I don't even know exactly, but it isn't rational, right? It's not something you came to by applying your reason to the world. It's something fundamentally that lacks that kind of rationality. Doesn't have reasonable arguments. This one bugs me a little bit because I probably shouldn't comment on this as much as I am, but I will. I think you could look at something like Thomas Aquinas, William of Ockham, you know, even more contemporary figures like William Lane Craig and his use of, say, the Kalam cosmological argument and these sorts of things. To say that faith doesn't have any reasonable arguments, or even historical arguments, right, for either Islam or Christianity, right, is I think, obviously a testament to the power of that Enlightenment narrative that says that religion isn't reasonable, so there can't be any reasonable arguments for religion. Now, as it happens, I will say I've heard lots of reasonable arguments for every kind of religious system that you can imagine, right? I've heard reasonable arguments for Christianity. I've heard reasonable arguments for Islam. I've heard reasonable arguments for Buddhism. I may not have heard a reasonable argument for Hinduism, but that's on me because I just haven't sought it out. I'm sure there are reasonable arguments why someone would believe that this system is true. But the fact that people just believe, young people believe sort of ipso facto that there are no reasonable arguments for religious systems, I think is odd, right? And suggests, rather a lack of depth in their search. And I'll have more to say on this. Like, there's two quotes at the end of this kind of unit that drive me absolutely up the wall. Maybe, I don't know, I'll show my cards here. A lot of these arguments and these kind of cultural narratives, I think, are very, very bad. They don't make a lot of sense to me because whether you agree with the arguments of, say, someone like Thomas Aquinas, or Duns Scotus, or William Lane Craig, or Fulton Sheen, or Robert Barron, or any other number of kind of I got one guy's name, and John Lennox, right? Whether you agree with their arguments or not, they are reasonable arguments. Whether you think they're successful arguments, I think is a different story. But these things, I think, kind of get conflated in young people, right? That, because they might have trouble buying this sort of narrative, and it doesn't have proof in the empirical sense that they're not good arguments, or they're not reasonable in some way. And I'll put my cards on the table. I find that to be a very shallow argument, one that doesn't consider things very deeply, especially on a philosophical level, and it sort of makes me a little crazy. Okay. And with all these things together, right, it has no epistemic or epistemological validity, right? Essentially saying, like, epistemology, I'm sure you all know the term, is, basically how we know what we know, right? How do we know what we know? What are valid forms of argumentation? What are valid forms of evidence? And the fact that, young people do seem to think that religion has no epistemic validity. That things like personal experience, the history of revelation, the histories of religion, philosophy, none of them have epistemological validity compared to science, is something that I will probably go to my grave sort of feeling uncomfortable with. Because, I found as much truth in my life in the plays of Shakespeare and the novels of Dostoevsky as I have ever in any scientific statement made by anyone, right? And so, this is what you get when your professor, did his first degree in English and the other one in Russian language and literature. You get, a person deeply shaped by different forms of truth. So this one bothers me because it's like, well, those things aren't true because they're not, so is Dostoevsky true? Well, he's not true in the scientific sense. I'm like, well, I've never read anything more true than Crime and Punishment. This may not make sense to you. And again, I'm rambling a little. I apologize. But these statements do kind of bug me because I'm like, when we talk about young people, I really think it's a disservice to have this very narrow version of what truth is. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'll move on. My little rant is over. Okay. Yeah, and so from Mangloss and Smith, this idea came up again and again in our interviews. Science and logic are how we really know things about our world, and religious faith either violates or falls short of the standards of scientific knowledge. Right, because there are other forms of knowledge that religion speaks to. It's not speaking to scientific knowledge, or it shouldn't try to, right? We shouldn't have, the Noah's Ark exhibit in Tennessee or wherever the hell it is, Kansas. I don't care even. It's stupid, uh, in my opinion. Because, where there's dinosaurs on the ark, because it's dumb. But yeah, this idea that there's no other way of knowing things, right? That the scientific standard of knowledge is the only way humans know things, to me, again, strikes me as a very impoverished and philosophically poor idea. And the fact that it's so pervasive, again, speaks to that Enlightenment myth and how powerful it is. And I think how shallowly we think about, and maybe young people specifically, but I think people in general, certainly I know lots of emerging adults and senior citizens who think this way as well. How shallowly we think about what truth actually is. Anyway, my commentary on this is over. I'm sorry. All right, so that's from Christian Smith in his talk. The underlying reality behind all this is science has the facts. Science has the facts. And religion is just your opinion. That structures the outlook of how young people lean into this question, right? Science has the facts. Religion is just your opinion. I think we can hear here also, again, I'm going back to my buddy Peter Berger. We hear the echoes of pluralism in this as well, right? With so many religious systems sort of on display in society, of course, for young people, right? Religion is going to seem like an opinion because there's lots of different ones. And science seems so certain, even though right within science, there's lots of opinion too. Like string theory, different cosmological models. Are we in a what do they call it, a multiverse or what? Lots of different thoughts. Science, I think, is much less certain than people sort of think it is. But anyway, I said I would not comment too much more on this. I do think it's really interesting, though. That this idea that science has the facts, religion's just your opinion. Again, measuring religion by science's standards, I think, is an interesting problem because it, shouldn't speak to the same thing because it's not, ostensibly. Sorry, I said I wouldn't comment anymore. I'll say one last thing. Science is interested in the material world. And if you look at certainly the Abrahamic faiths, but I think you could include Hinduism in here as well and aspects of Buddhism, they're interested in the transcendent, right? As you can't find evidence of God because God is not a thing in the universe. In all but a few religious systems. I think in Mormonism, God has a body. But in most others, God is not a thing in the universe and therefore not open to scientific inquiry. But right, it's like, again, science has the facts, religion is just your opinion. Because people are wanting to judge everything by that scientific standard. And that's how people look at the question. And I think an impoverished kind of view, in my opinion. And that'll just be my opinion. It won't be on the test. You don't have to repeat my opinion on the test, I promise. Okay, so American teenagers in the National Study of Youth and Religion, Smith says, are almost evenly split over whether science should be accountable to moral and religious teachings and constraints or not. Half of them say no. Now, again, I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent or too much of a commentary. I think this should be about as profoundly distressing to people as almost anything else. Why do I say that? Because fundamentally what this is saying is that, of the kind of coming generation, half of them at this point in their life, and it may have shifted even more since then, believe that basically because science is the highest authority, that science shouldn't really be accountable to any moral and religious system that constrains what science should be able to do. I mean, anecdotally, I think you see this, say in the works of someone like Yuval Noah Harari, in his book Homo Deus, where he basically posits that, human beings should be able to fundamentally use science and technology to transform themselves essentially into gods. That there essentially, I mean, what Harari's saying in a lot of cases is there should be no limits whatsoever, whether religious or moral in a secular sense or religious specifically, that govern what science is and is not allowed to do. And the reason this scares me is because to me this sounds a great deal like the beliefs of the eugenicists, from the late part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, who thought that basically we should be able to use science and reason to transform society and human beings in the best ways possible. So, we should selectively breed humans so that we only got the best genetic traits. And we should sterilize those who were, fundamentally sort of inferior because, the dictates of, say, in this case, Darwinian science, right, the science of evolution, should dictate how we govern our society because that scientific fact was so powerful, and it is, of course. It's such a powerful explanatory tool of how the world got to be what it is. There's no denying it. That it should, ultimately govern what we do regardless of morality, regardless of, any kind of social constraints. The barbarism of the Nazis, certainly in the concentration camps and the cruel medical experiments they did, were governed by much this kind of idea that science for science's sake was ultimately worthwhile. So again, I'm not saying American teenagers are like Nazis. I don't want to give you that impression. But just this attitude that somehow science is somehow exempt, in a sense, from moral and religious teachings and constraints is one that I think comes with potentially profound consequences. And that half of American teenagers thought that science should just science because it is so objective and it should have no further constraints upon it. I do think is slightly terrifying. It slightly terrifies me. At some point I'll be dead, but I hope to live a while longer, and I hope not to see this kind of vision of the world ultimately take over.